Hi, I'm Hannah Shidlowski. I'm 19 years old, white, and a journalism student living on Treaty 7 territory in Calgary, Alberta. I've lived in Canada my whole life, but I've never really known much about my own cultural background. I used to think that didn't matter, but now I understand that this kind of unawareness is part of privilege. Before this course, I thought reconciliation meant symbolic gestures, like saying sorry, not something that had anything to do with my daily life. Then I came across a quote from Abigail Eisenberg that shifted my thinking. She writes, "The challenge is to convince Canadians today to understand that they are implicated in the injustice that occurred in residential schools and are responsible for redressing it." That hit hard because I am one of those Canadians. I didn't attend or run those schools, but I've grown up in systems that were shaped by them. This course helped me realize that reconciliation isn't just about looking back, it's about how we choose to exist in the present and how we show up going forward. This slide represents one of the biggest shifts in how I think about injustice, the difference between interactional and structural harm. I learned about this through Abigail Eisenberg's work, drawing on political theorists Iris Marion Young and Cheryl Ann Liu. Interactional injustice is about individual actions, like the abuse that happened in residential schools. Structural injustice, on the other hand, goes deeper. It's about the systems and institutions that are designed in ways that keep inequality going, even after the individuals involved are gone. That's what the quote on the slide shows. On the left, Eisenberg writes, "Most Canadians do not view reconciliation as something that involves them." It reflects how easy it is to feel disconnected, to treat reconciliation as someone else's responsibility. But on the right side, she pushes back. The challenge is to convince Canadians today to understand that they are implicated in the injustice that occurred in residential schools and are responsible for redressing it. That second quote carries more weight, literally, on this slide because it reflects truth, discomfort, and accountability. The Truth and Reconciliation Commission did a lot to expose this structural harm, calling what happened cultural genocide and released the 94 calls to action. But as both Eisenberg and Liu point out, the underlying system, like colonial education, racist policies, and economic marginalization, still shape this present. Before this class, I didn't understand that you could be part of a problem without ever meaning to do harm. But I've grown up inside structures that were never built for Indigenous people, or worse, were built to erase them. One moment that really stuck with me was thinking back to my Catholic school education. We barely talked about residential schools, even though the church ran so many of them. And when it did come up, it felt like something tragic but finished, something historical. Now I see that the structures that allowed this harm are still there. Even the way I was educated protected those systems instead of questioning them. Understanding structural injustice changed how I think about responsibility. It's not about blame, it's about recognizing that if I benefit from a broken system, I have a role in changing it. This slide explores something that really challenged me, the idea that reconciliation can be performative and even harmful. In his article, Joe Wark critiques how land acknowledgements, especially in universities, have become more about settler discomfort than decolonization. He writes, "Land acknowledgements are not inherently decolonial, especially when they serve to make settlers feel better without changing anything." That quote made me pause. I've heard so many land acknowledgements at school, at events, even in this course, and I never really questioned them. I thought they were respectful. But now I see if those words aren't followed by action, like returning land, shifting power, or reforming institutions, they're just performance. They make settlers feel better, but they don't create justice. Work also introduced the concept of refusal, when Indigenous people say no to the roles and expectations placed on them by settlers. That shook me too. I used to think reconciliation was about everyone coming together. Now I understand that real reconciliation might mean stepping back, giving up power, and learning to sit with discomfort without needing to be praised for it. In The Wretched of the Earth, Fanon argues that colonization doesn't just take land, it attacks identity, culture, and the self. His work made me realize that reconciliation can't be about comfort or closure, it has to be about justice, freedom, and transformation. That connects to the Peru TRC, which followed a three-step process: truth, justice, reconciliation. The idea was that healing can only happen after truth is told, and then justice must follow, whether through accountability or deep structural change. On the left, the photo shows a Peruvian protester holding a sign that reads, "Peru en duelo," Peru in mourning. It represents the pain and the demand for justice that truth telling alone can't resolve. And on the right, Kent Monkman's painting, The Scream captures a Canadian version of that same violence, Indigenous children being taken from their families by RCMP and church officials. It's not historical fiction, it's part of the legacy Canada is still reckoning with. When I compare Peru's Peroche to Canada's TRC, I have to ask, did we skip the justice part? The Canadian TRC created space for truth, but what have we actually done to repair the harm? Fanon and Peru helped me understand that reconciliation isn't about making settlers feel better, it's about structural change, and real change takes discomfort, giving up power, and committing to justice. One of the learning outcomes I chose to focus on is understanding the factors behind the TRC's call to action and how they relate to my own positionality. As someone who has lived in Canada my entire life, I used to see reconciliation as something the government was handling, not something that involved me personally. I didn't realize that many of these calls to action were actually directed at ordinary Canadians, not just institutions. For example, call to action number 92 challenges the private sectors to adopt the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples and apply it to policies and practices. That really made me think about how everyday systems, like journalism, media, education, or business, all play a role in reconciliation. As a journalism student, this hit close to home. I started thinking about how media can either amplify Indigenous voices or silence them. It made me reflect on how my positionality, as a white settler in media, carries responsibility. I have to think more critically about what stories get told, how they're told, and who gets to tell them. This outcome helped me to move from seeing reconciliation as a passive process to something that actually requires action, especially from people in positions like mine. For my second learning outcome, I focused on understanding the ideological and historical forces that shape how nations construct their identities and how these stories affect reconciliation. This course helped me unpack the disconnect between what Canada says it is and what I now understand to be true. On the left side of this slide, you see the story I grew up believing. Canada is often described as a peaceful nation, but we're built on colonial foundations. We call ourselves a leader in reconciliation, but that often means symbolic gestures, not real structural change. We celebrate being multicultural and inclusive, while Indigenous voices are still excluded from many systems. And we claim to be human rights champions, even as many of the TRC's calls to action remain unfulfilled. These myths aren't just harmless, they protect settler comfort and allow injustice to continue. That's why the quote on the side matters to me. If injustice never follows truth, then reconciliation is just a story we tell ourselves. This outcome pushed me to question who benefits from the good Canadian narrative and what truth we still need to face, not just historically, but globally. This course didn't just change how I think about reconciliation, it changed how I see journalism. I used to think being neutral meant being fair, but now I know that neutrality can protect the status quo, and the status quo often benefits settlers. I've started paying more attention to whose voices are missing from the stories we don't hear, and what power gets protected when we don't ask deeper questions. For me, reconciliation in journalism means amplifying Indigenous voices, challenging stereotypes, and not being afraid to hold powerful systems accountable. I won't always get it right, but I know what I want to stand for and who I want to listen to. One of the hardest and most important shifts I made in this course was realizing that the version of Canada I grew up in was a myth. I believed we were peaceful, inclusive, fair. I thought we were already doing reconciliation and doing it well. But the quote on the slide reminds me that many of those beliefs are narratives we accept without question. They comfort us, but they also protect settlers from accountability. I used to believe this myth too, but like the speech bubble says, it protected me more than it protected the truth. This course helped me to start asking harder questions. Who does this story serve? Who gets erased? And what would it mean to build a national identity around truth, not comfort? Looking back on this course, I can honestly say my understanding of reconciliation has changed in every way. I used to think of it as something symbolic, an apology, a ceremony, maybe something you talked about in class. But now I understand that real reconciliation is about accountability, justice, and deep structural change. One of the biggest shifts for me was recognizing how easy it is, especially for white settlers like me, to believe we're on the right side of history without ever doing anything uncomfortable. It's easy to accept land acknowledgements without action, to believe Canada is better than other countries without asking what harm still goes unaddressed here. It's easy to perform reconciliation without actually practicing it. This course helped me challenge that mindset. Through Eisenberg and Liu, I learned what structural justice really means. Through Fanon and the Peru TRC, I saw how colonial violence isn't just history, it's a system. And through work, I started questioning the stories I've accepted as truth and what it means to let go of settler comfort. I've also started connecting this to my field, journalism. I can now understand how stories hold power. They can amplify marginalized voices or they can protect dominant ones. As a future journalist, I know I won't always get it right, but I want to stay open, stay critical, and stay accountable. There's no checklist for reconciliation, but this course taught me that it's not someone else's job, it's mine too. And the more I learned, the more I realized reconciliation isn't about being right, it's about being willing to change.